Good afternoon, everyone. It gives me immense pleasure to welcome you here to the inaugural James Milroy Lecture on Language and Social Inequality. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Jim and his influence and legacy before introducing our inaugural lecturer on the occasion, who's Professor Leslie Milroy. And this couldn't be. Come on in, come on. Do you know if there are any more of them? Leslie Milroy, and I'll tell you a little bit about her in a minute, but let's talk about the subject of it's really our memorial lecture really. So Professor James Milroy was a world-famous authority in sociolinguistics, historical linguistics, and he was particularly interested in the study of in sociolinguistics, which, as you know, studied between language and society. And he was emeritus professor of linguistics at the University of Sheffield until his death in 2017. But of course, he worked at the University of Michigan in the US for a long time with Leslie, and Queen's University Belfast, and of course Newcastle University. It was really at Queen's in Belfast where you really got to grips with language and social networks, and that really groundbreaking research, which I think influenced us all in terms of how we understand social networks. Jim's research focused on questions of language and social inequality, and in particular he explored questions and ideas about correct and incorrect language, and this was truly groundbreaking and completely challenged, received thinking about prescriptivism, about standardization, and so on. And what his work does is it interrogates the discourses of historical linguistics and how language ideologies inflect the way in which we receive and indeed transmit language history. So he examines how historical processes of language standardization create discrimination against low-status groups of speakers. He was also an expert on Middle English dialects and wrote a landmark chapter in the Cambridge History of the English Language in 1992 on Middle English dialects. Brilliant chapter. So the aim of the series as a whole is to increase public awareness of language inequality, and we're surrounded by it. And unfortunately, those ideas and challenges that Jim issued throughout his intellectual life, I think are still with us, and we need to keep renewing those challenges. And so this lecture is very much in the spirit of much of his research. Some key works, in addition to that wonderful Middle English dialectology chapter, Authority in Language, co-authored with Leslie, now in its fourth edition. That first came out in 1985, and really has been immensely influential in sociolinguistics at that time. Linguistics, Variation and Change, which was on the Historical Sociolinguistics of English in 1992, and Bill Kretschmar writes a wonderful review of that, saying it's actually one of the most intelligent treatments on the subject that he'd ever come across. But he said that his students did not find it an easy read. So, gee, Dr. K, we're sure glad you're here to explain this to us. And he notes that he would litter the text with exclamation marks simply because it was just so compelling. And then Real English, the grammar of English dialects in the British Isles, also really important and certainly really influential in my own thinking, also co-edited with Leslie. And the collaboration with Leslie, as I mentioned, included the groundbreaking work on the social networks of working class communities in Belfast, and Leslie's own works, in addition to a great deal of collaboration with Jim, Language and Social Networks, 1980, One Speaker, Two Languages, co-authored in 1995, hugely influential, Observing and Analysing Natural Language, 1987, and Sociolinguistics, Method and Interpretation. I guess it's the methodological impact of her work that has, I think, continues to make a difference to British sociolinguistics, and indeed sociolinguistics in the US and elsewhere. Leslie retired from the University of Michigan in 2004.
That's right.
Yeah. Having beforehand worked in Newcastle, but you retired to Oxfordshire. It's an interesting choice. Anyway, but currently lecturing and teaching there. And so we're really thrilled to welcome her here, back to Sheffield, really. And the talk is Dialects, Languages, Nations, Local and International Images of Standardness and Correctness. So I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Susan. Thank you. Well, Susan's given an excellent review of the topic, so that's handy. You know all about language and inequality, and I believe some of you have been to a workshop. And I should say, first of all, I'm very happy to be in Sheffield, having lived here for a while. As Susan pointed out, Jim was a professor in Sheffield for some years, and his interests were highly practical. He was involved, actually, in training speech therapists. And he was always very anxious to teach them about the language as it was. He didn't want speech therapy, language pathology to get mixed up with elocution. And you'd be amazed how frequently that happened. Maybe it still does. So it's great to be here. It's great to be focusing actually on this topic, very important topic. And I'd like to thank Emma and Nick, and I think Hannah. I've been told maybe there's somebody else I should know. Sorry?
Holly.
Holly? Where is she? Hi, Holly. Thank you very much for organising this, because it seems to me a very ambitious piece of work, rolling in a workshop for the students, first of all, and then a lecture now. And it's very nice to see, I think some of the students have come along, haven't you, from the workshop. So it's nice to see all of you, a very nice mixed audience. Now, a practical question. We have a handout which you've got. That's nice. You can take it home with you. It's got some nice quotations on it you might like. But there's also a PowerPoint presentation going on concurrently with this, which Nick is masterminding. I couldn't do it to save my life, I don't think, without getting mixed up. But have you all got sight of the handout? Because if you have, I'll probably just talk about section, whatever it is. If anyone's not, I mean, the PowerPoint will be in front of you.
Raise your hand if you need.
Oh yes, there it is. The PowerPoint slides are visible to you, so you can follow it on that. And I believe each slide is marked with the relevant section of the handout, so it should be quite easy to follow either. Okay, well, let me just give you a few preliminary words about notions of linguistic adequacy, correctness, and so on. We're all very, very familiar, I think, with lively public discussions of adequacy and correctness, generally carried out with reference to an assumed ideal standard form of the language. Now, this afternoon, what I want to do is explore both the character of public debates about language, just look at them in a little detail, and the related notion of a standard language, mainly but not exclusively English. Now, I want to begin by saying that this concept is generally treated as unproblematic. People, on the whole, don't query what a standard is. You just talk about standard English, or speak proper English, will you? You can put various words for it. But people generally think everyone knows what that is. It's treated as unproblematic, not only by the general public, but I would say, to their shame, by professional linguists as well. Many of them think it's obvious what the standard is. You see, not all sociolinguists, but we'll see that it's very difficult, actually, to treat a standard language as a specifiable linguistic entity, and characterizing its nature and social function is actually complex and problematic. I think this will come through. So what I want to do before we go any further is just look at the main themes. That's section 1. Because I'll be coming back to them, and that's why it's handy to have a handout, because you can refer back. Well, first of all, you've got images of the standard language standardization, and I'll be arguing that the standard language ideology, now what the standard language ideology is the idea that there is a single correct form of the language. And that standard language ideology is tied up very, very strongly with nationalism. Okay, with nationalist ideologies. So that's point number 1. point number 2, I guess, discourses, the way people talk about this. You've got discourses of race and class that pop up when you talk about standard English, discourses of purity and strength versus corruption, weakness and decay. That's the kind of language you often get around correctness. Quite strong language, actually. And I also want to look at responses of professional linguists to public linguistic controversy, because they do get into it quite a lot. Jim and I did, when we wrote Authority in Language, we tangled quite painfully, actually, with some people in the Thatcher government. And I'm quite willing to talk about that later, but it's a whole topic in itself, if anyone wants to ask about it. So it is a political issue. Now, okay, so the idea of a standard language, what I want to do is look at different images of it in different countries. It's different in the US and the UK, and I want to look at Norway as well. And we have a Norwegian expert here in the shape of Paul Kerswell, who I'm sure will have something to say if we get on to Norway. Now then, the final theme, language ideologies. Now, I want to look at this term ideology. It's very often associated with nasty things, isms, things like Marxism, sexism, racism, and so on. But I would like to think of an ideology as a perspective on language. Everybody, I think Susan touched on this when she talked about Jim's article on histories of language. Histories of language are not neutral. There is no view from nowhere. People who write histories of language often are peddling, they're pushing some sort of agenda. Okay? So an ideology, everyone is at the mercy of their own language ideologies. And I'd like you to broaden out the notion of ideology. There is the standard ideology, which is there is only one correct form of the language, but we all have a perspective on language. And I can just begin by saying variability is everywhere in communities, and that brings us to the topic in a sense of variability. It's noticed by social actors, that is ordinary speakers. It's treated selectively as a property of locally meaningful social groups. So all of us do this. We talk about trendy people, we talk about ignorant people, sloppy people, and very often we do this with reference to language. Now, in the United States, there are examples of varieties which are socially salient enough to be named and reified. We'll be looking at one or two of those. African American English, New York City English, Southern American English. Now, the social meanings, the linguistic features associated with these varieties, as opposed to those associated with American English generally, and the social meanings they carry, are not generally accessible to outsiders. That's another point that you need to be clear on. But the social baggage we associate with language variation is localized. And the same, of course, applies to comparable lists you could compile in any other country you'd care to name, I believe. So few Americans, for example, will be able to tune into the features which index sexish in Germany. Brummie or Scouse or Geordie in England, they'd just say, oh gee, you have a lovely accent. That would be a fairly characteristic American response. They certainly wouldn't discriminate between them, and they certainly wouldn't understand what was meant when rude things were said about Brummie, which is very common. We'll come on to that in a few minutes. So these people are not perspective or ideology free. So translate ideology as perspective. It just happens that some people, in addition to having perspectives in language, have power as well, and their own agenda and means of actually pushing it and carrying it out in a big way. And those are the ones perhaps responsible for the development of standard ideologies. But again, I think you've got to be very careful to remember that there is no view from nowhere. That's what I'd like to push. Okay, so you generally get evaluations in morally and aesthetically loaded terms of disliked varieties, stigmatized varieties. Again, terms like sloppy, lazy, ignorant, ugly, or just wrong. Words like that. And typically, a small number of low-level features emerge in public commentary as indices of these groups, but not many. And if you look at the historical record, and the complex structural architecture underlying all human language, two common assumptions emerge as equally untenable, which are assumed. One is the existence of an ideal linguistic standard and the linguistic inadequacy of non-standard varieties. Now, I just want to look briefly at the linguist's perspective on those two assumptions. First, on the matter of the ideal standard, local dialects cannot reasonably be said to deviate from standard languages. I'm telling a lot of you things you know already. On the contrary, history shows that standard languages are superposed on a pre-existing condition of variation. So, to say that dialects deviate is wrong. It's just wrong, full stop. So, history shows that standard languages are superposed in that way, and it's inevitable, natural. It can be attributed to a number of language internal and social dynamics. And second, as languages change, so do images of correctness. Now, all these things will be popping up, but it's good to get them straight. So, for example, usages, subject-verb concord is a well-known non-standard feature, something you was, right, we was at Rigolettas with you boss, that shows up in very well-known American film. Well, you was and we was were fine for the English novelist Anthony Trollope's early 19th century aristocratic characters, but they're not fine for aristocratic, elegant speakers now. You see, so even the image, what is counted as standard varies a lot. Okay, so now for the nitty-gritty. We'll look at the process of language standardization set out in section 2. This is language standardization and nationalist ideologies. And this paraphrases the analysis of the Dutch anthropological linguists Jan Blommert and Jeffrey Schuurden. And they point, Einar Haugen had that idea much earlier actually, but they were very elaborate on it. They point out its association with political imperatives, such as claims to national distinctiveness and autonomy, the construction of internal social cohesion. Now we'll be looking again at this in what follows. Nation-states have regularly developed nationalist ideologies whereby linguistic and other differences are viewed as dangerous. The ideal society is identified as socially and linguistically homogeneous. I think I've heard quite a lot of that on the news recently. The idea that difference is not good. And Blommert and Verschuren described this as the doctrine of homogenism, and very much associated with the nationalist version of language ideology. Well, just very briefly, a little comparative stuff. The idea that the best society is one without potentially dangerous intergroup differences is certainly pervasive in many countries, and in contemporary Europe it's particularly strong actually in France. Again, we may have people here, we almost certainly have people here who know more about France than I do and can comment on this. But dialects and minority languages to this day in France are associated with sedition and conflict. This was something that was developed very strongly during the revolutionary and post-revolutionary period. And there are institutionalized procedures for imposing the standard on former French colonies. So, for example, I had the great experience many years ago, 30 years ago, of being invited to give a lecture in French, which was a terrible ordeal for me. But this was in Senegal, a French colony, a former French colony. And I had a great time. I could communicate perfectly with the Africans, with the natives of Senegal, because they spoke the old-fashioned standard French I had been taught here in 1958. But I couldn't understand a word of what was going on when I tried to speak to the people from the Sorbonne, you see. So this old-fashioned standard French was imposed on the colonies. Now, nothing quite like that happened with the British colonies. It was very different there. So in Britain, the doctrine of homogenism is, there's obviously a centralized standard language dating back many centuries, but the doctrine of homogenism is much less strong. So you get indigenized and new varieties of English legitimized with names like American English, Scottish English, Welsh English. We all talk about that. Linguists talk about it. Ordinary people, non-linguists talk about it. Indian English, and even world Englishes. You see, all these are reified and given names, all built into the descriptive system. But in France, this is nonsense. There's no concept of legitimacy for Senegal French, Brittany French, even though they're distinctive. And Canadian French, of course, is notoriously stigmatized. Okay? So these are different. Now, right, so that's the nationalistic stuff I'd like you to bear in mind. And what I'd like to do is move on to the quotations in section 2, where we're going to look at variation and the way attitudes, if you like, popped up at various points in history. And if you look at B here, what we've got is a 16th century example. This is taken from the work of the Finnish research group who looked at personal letters. And this one is a personal letter of Elizabeth I. And what I'd like to draw your attention to is the alternation between eth and es, third person singular verb endings, in a letter written by the Queen in 1585. And she says, "He knoweth not the price of my blood." You'll probably know that, most of you, that the eth form is the older one, and it's also southern. The s form actually came from the north, and probably had a lot to do with immigration into London. There may have been other reasons, like the royal house being associated with Scotland. I don't know. We can ponder that. But anyway, "He knoweth not the price of my blood, which should be spilt by the bloody hand of a murderer. I am assured he knoweth." Okay? So, in a very short space, Queen Elizabeth is using the eth and es forms. She doesn't care. That's what everybody did. They were allowed to do that. We're not, but she was. Okay? Therefore, I hope you will not deny you a truth. Now, let's fast forward to 1711 and look at change, which was viewed as degeneration. Elizabeth didn't think Noah's was one down on Noath. But this is what Joseph Addison says. He complains about a natural aversion to loquacity by English speakers, which has resulted in undesirable changes. And I've got two examples of his here. And he says, the abbreviation of several words that are terminated in eth, that's exactly what Elizabeth was doing, by substituting an s in the room of the last syllable, as in drowns, walks, arrives, and innumerable other words, he says, which in the pronunciation of our forefathers was drowneth, walketh, arriveth. This has wonderfully multiplied a letter which was too frequent in the English tongue. So we've got an idea that there's something wrong with the letter S. Okay? We've got too many of them already. And you see the interesting arguments that are being constructed here to justify the choice of one versus another, as well as the idea of degeneration. And he says, and added to that hissing on our language, which is taken so much notice of by foreigners. So the foreigners don't like it. And then he moves on to another one, and this is the past tense. Closing in one syllable, the termination of predicative tense, as in the words drowned, walked, arrived. For drowned, walked, arrived, which has very much disfigured the tongue. Again, look at the language that's developed. And turned a tenth part of our smoothest words into so many clusters of consonants. So he doesn't just say it's happened. It's nasty. This is more remarkable because the want of vowels in our language, we already didn't have enough vowels, he says. And this has been the general complaint of our politest authors. And I could not resist adding Dr. Johnson's twist on this. It's a bit of a comment, I suppose, on current politics. This was in his preface to his famous dictionary, and his view of linguistic change was tongues, like governments, have a general tendency to degeneration. Okay? Now, you may want to think that about governments, but I don't think you should really think it about tongues. Okay, so again, we're going to fast forward to more recent changes. D. Tony Langley. This is a hero, or rather a character in a novel of Ian McEwan's about depression, actually, called Black Dogs. And this boy, it was written in 1992, actually, and Tony Langley was an upper-class child, I suppose, the teenage son of a diplomat, cultivated friends from the new high-rises towards Shepherd's Bush. He worked up a dim-witted mode of speech. He didn't just cultivate the language of the people in the high-rises. It was dim-witted. Glottal teased, I think, and I goes to him, for I said to him, which became an ingrained habit. Now, the fictional time was around 65, actually, but the novel was written in 92. And what I would actually like to note, of course, is that these are changes that have moved on in English and spread. I first came across, I think, the so-called TH fronting. I think when we lived in Sheffield. Now, is there I was trying to remember, a friend of my son's visited our house. Is there a Kelvin Flats? Does that make any sense?
It was. Yes, it was.
It's gone now, but it was a kind of disreputable place.
It was a big sort of wall of flats.
Yes. Well, there was a kid who used to come to our house from there, and I first heard, the I think and all the rest of it from him. And I thought, good heavens, he's got a developmental problem. I didn't think it was a working class speech or anything like that. But I thought, he'll need a speech therapist to talk to him. And of course, it was nothing of the sort. But that was a very early encounter with that. Now, Paul has written a lot about this. A number of us have. And this is a change that has swept through English. And it's people like weathermen on BBC use it. It's used all the time. It's everywhere. It's pretty well everywhere. Now, I can give you a good anecdote on this. In America, it's associated with African American English very strongly. Now, I gave a lecture in America to a bunch of linguistic anthropologists now let me get this straight, it was 2011, and I gave the example of TH fronting as a change. And I was teaching in Oxford at the time, and I said, everyone uses it. It's spread from working class speech all the way through. And I said, my Oxford students used it. And I had trouble with them. I couldn't even get them to hear the difference between I think and I think. They really didn't. And everyone went silent and strange. And I learned afterwards that I had forgotten that it was associated with African American English. And these very sophisticated people could not get their heads round the idea that Oxford students were doing this. They just could not. And that was why I got the strange reaction, you see, anyway, I think that's worth mentioning. It's gone everywhere. It's gone up to Glasgow, and it's been called Jockney in Glasgow because they think it's been transmitted from London speech. So there you go. A lot of work being done on this. And the glottal, of course, glottal stops are everywhere. They have now penetrated generally. They're all family use and the younger members. So what you want, not what do you want. There's a very big distinction between older and younger people there. Okay, so these changes are happening all the time, and they stop being stigmatized, of course. They stop being noticed once they spread outside the group. If it's a stigmatized group that's innovated, and it's very common for a stigmatized group to innovate, once they spread outside, people just somehow stop noticing them. Okay? Well, what I want to do now, so we've established, I think, that you've got this change going on the whole time, and that images of correctness will vary quite a lot. And what I'd like to do is get on to reactions in public debates to language variation and change. And this guy, Marsh, George Marsh, was actually a favourite of Jim's. He liked those American scholars, really because of the intemperate nature of their language. And George Marsh is pretty good on this. He was a professor at Columbia, and I have to say I'm very glad I didn't have to sit in his classes. And he's talking about the change from the house is building to the house is being built, the emergence of the passive in that context. And what he says is, I have spoken of the ignorance of grammarians as a frequent cause of the corruption of language. So you see, he's blaming linguists for this. It's not working class people, it's actual linguists are responsible. An instance of this is the clumsy and unidiomatic continuing presence of the passive voice, which originating not in the sound common sense of the people. Now, when you hear somebody using the term common sense, be careful, because it means they're not doing any analysis. Okay, that's what common sense is. It's something that you want everyone to accept, and you don't want them to think about it. Right. So it originates in the sound common sense of the people. It would suit him, I think, on other occasions, to think that the people did not have sound common sense, but never mind. He thinks they're fine. But in the brain of some grammatical pretender, has widely spread and threatens to establish itself as another solecism in addition to the many which our syntax already presents. So we've got a lot of bad things happening. This is just one more. So the phrase, the house is being built, or the house is building, is an awkward neologism, which neither convenience, intelligibility, nor syntactic congruity demands, and the use of which therefore ought to be discountenanced. We should stop it, he says. Okay. Well, it's really the vehemence of the reaction that I wanted to highlight here, because it seems silly now, doesn't it? Why should you bother? Because we all talk about the houses being built, not the houses building. And I now want to move on to something from John Rickford's work. John Rickford is an American sociolinguist, and he's written a lot about Ebonics, and that is a name for African American English. And basically, what happened there in the Ebonics controversy, it followed the decision in 1997 of the School Board of Oakland, California, to use African American English as a tool to facilitate mastery of standard English by African American speakers. It's very heavily stigmatized. So the idea was that you let the kids use their dialect in school, you taught them in the dialect, you allowed them to speak it, and you tried to then use that as a tool for facilitating standard English. Now that seems very civilized, and it's actually quite similar to what is done in Norway, actually. The dialect's accepted, you use it, but then you get the standard. Well, this created a huge row. The reaction was overwhelmingly negative. In the flash flood of email on America Online, Ebonics was described as lazy English, bastardized English, poor grammar, fractured slang. Oakland's decision to recognize Ebonics and use it to facilitate mastery of standard English. You see, nobody was trying to say you shouldn't learn standard English. It's just use your own dialect while you're learning it. Also elicited superlatives of negativity, ridiculous, ludicrous, very, very stupid, a terrible mistake. Well, the point is that Rickford and other linguists who addressed the issue publicly reported frustration at the hostile media representation that they're describing there, the lack of success of their own efforts to argue for the legitimacy of AAE as a linguistic system. And linguists generally did this, and it's really the linguist's strategy I'm interested in here. They did this on the basis of its complex internal structure and the cognitive endowments required by speakers of all human languages. That's very often the line that linguists use. And in fact, the Auckland decision was rational on other grounds too. I got involved quite heavily in researching racial polarization and discrimination in Detroit. Some of my students were writing PhDs on the city. Quite a job it was. Command of standard English was an absolutely crucial criterion in selecting candidates for jobs. There as here. We'll come on to this in a minute. So there are no surprises, but a guy called Reynolds Farley and a bunch of colleagues wrote a book called Detroit Divided, which was a kind of Bible for a long time for us. And the ability to speak English well was treated by employers as a hard skill. In other words, it was like knowing how to handle computers. It wasn't like dressing nicely and having a pleasant demeanour. It was actually treated as a hard skill. And So you really were in trouble if you spoke African American English or had features which identified you as an AAE speaker. So men, African Americans, particularly men, do not fare well, at all well, in the linguistic market, and spoken language is a very significant feature. So by preventing the Oakland board from doing something quite rational, you're actually doing something quite threatening and life-changing to the children in your care. So anyway, there's quite an impressive body of research in the English-speaking world and elsewhere which suggests that the standard varieties learnt more easily by speakers of non-standard varieties if those varieties are recognised and differences between them and the standard are made explicit. But that's not generally what's done. But that is precisely what the Oakland board had understood. And again, it's the viciousness of the reaction I want to focus on here. That's why I'm dwelling on it. And the damage, actually, that does. And you get parallel examples elsewhere. Marty LaForest writes of the media's scepticism which greeted her attempts to discuss the structured nature of Quebec French, for example. Canadian French being notoriously stigmatized by European French speakers. In the UK, a similar experience was reported by Jean Aitchison. She was formerly Professor of Language and Communication at Oxford, and she gave the Reith Lectures series called The Language Web. And she dealt with general issues, language change, language acquisition, language structure, and many, but not all, responses, both in the media and from individuals, were very hostile and negative. She got a bunch of hate mail. You know, we associate that now, I think, with something rather different with social media. It's got much worse. But basically, what upset people most was the idea that dialects were structured and regular, they were not an inadequate deviation from standard English, that linguistic change was normal and inevitable and didn't amount to decline and decay. Those were the arguments that caused the most offence. And disagreements were often rudely dismissive and abusive, the kind of thing we've come to get used to in our politics now, but it was going on then. It's just that the internet hadn't developed in a way that made it as awful as it is now. So you get the strong reactions, and they're irrational. And if you try to explain them or say that they're rational, right? I don't want to come back to this, but it's what's relevant to this is the idea of ideology as perspective. You have to acknowledge that everybody has perspectives on language. And if linguists approach it abstractly, as a human, a cognitive endowment, they're not doing that. They're actually not treating it as a social object, treating language as a social object. That's what's partially wrong. And I will come back to this, but it's a major theme that pops up through it. So linguists, you often hear them lamenting the fact that the technical work of mathematicians, physicists, neuroscientists, biologists, but not linguists, is accepted as difficult and technical by the public. And they'll accept it without demanding to understand the details. Well, of course, it's not in the social world. The truth is that physicists like Galileo had trouble when their subjects were in the social world, you see. But if something is defined as being in the social world, it's very hard to get rational analysis accepted because of ideological views of all kinds pervading public understanding of them. So anyway, so negative public responses are prejudiced and uninformed according to linguists, and this is not a good attitude to have. You can indeed say they're wrong, but you do need to understand them and put them within a context and understand why they're there. So you've got several popular books available, and let's think of Steven Pinker's The Language Instinct. It's been around a few years, but it's a well-known example, and it sold lots of copies, but it didn't seem to do any good. It didn't seem to change public awareness at all. And let's now move on to some other reactions, because what I want to do is explore the way they tie in with national ideologies, distinctive national ideologies. And we're there with Rickford. We've seen that this is specifically African American English that you get this reaction to. But there is a racial dimension here which pops up in American commentaries. And of course I'll be looking at different standards later. But if you look at BrandonMathews, he also taught in Columbia, actually until 1924, somewhat before George Marsh. And he says linguistic decay, he says, is inseparable from racial decadence. Just like that. You know, they're tied up together, he says. And this was because of the immediate contact of English with a host of other and inferior tongues. Now, what he's referring to is the period of mass migration to the United States at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century. And that's also tied up with the development of a standard in America, which was associated actually with the Midwest, rather than the East Coast, because you got a huge loss of cultural capital in the old cities of the East Coast during that period. And that's the kind of comment you very frequently got in America. And one could go on about that, but I won't, because I want to contrast that with what was going on in Britain, and still goes on. And a very good source for a lot of this is Deborah Cameron's book, Language Hygiene. Have I got that title right? Yes, I think I have. Yeah, sorry, Verbal Hygiene. Now, she comments on a long-running debate in Britain on how English should be taught in schools. Now, I really don't know if it's still going on in quite this form, but it certainly was when we were writing Authority in Language in the 80s. She said, the teaching of correct English is persistently and quite melodramatically depicted as part of a more general struggle against dark social forces, and specifically as a means to counter the anarchy of the working class home and street. So you've got a feeling here that you've got to avoid working class people somehow creating anarchy, and it's the language of working class people that is the target here. And this, of course, is tied up with the Industrial Revolution in Britain and the legacy of that. So you've got very, very clear social issues involved. Now, what I'm really arguing is that we do need to think, before we get too upset about this, we need to think in terms of ideologies as perspectives. Now, there's quite a lot of work on this. I was involved in it when I was in America. There were a group of linguistic anthropologists called the Michigagoans from Michigan and Chicago, and they developed some quite interesting thinking. Michael Silverstein, Judith Irvine, they're quite well known, in fact. And one basic definition of a language ideology as a perspective is a set of beliefs about language articulated by users as a rationalization or justification of perceived language structure or use. So people notice variability around them, and then they develop a perspective on it. So they listen to some young man speaking, and they say, to do X is very masculine, right? They listen to some young woman, and they say, to do Y, it's rather trendy and kind of girly. So that's the kind of language you get. That's the ideological response. And of course, some people, as we've said, some social groups have power and authority to push their point of view, and that's why specifically standard ideologies need to be treated a little differently. But they shouldn't be dissociated from the idea of general perspectives, and they shouldn't just be called ignorant and stupid and wrong. You need to look at what's behind them. That's what I would suggest as a linguistic approach. Now, the kind of rhetoric that Deborah Cameron describes there is very, very common in Britain. and I won't say any more about it. It certainly was going on in the 80s. But what I also want to do is move on to section E, where we've got the impact on jobs. And this quotation we've got here was taken from a report in the Times in 1997, and recruitment specialists confessed that yes, people with strong regional accents were often discriminated against at work or when applying for jobs. The basic gist is if you have a Liverpool, Glasgow or Birmingham accent and you're really keen to get that job, then learn sign language before your interview. These are the three accents that are seen as negative by some employers. Okay, so that ties in very nicely with the idea that Deborah Cameron is pushing of the working class home and street, because these are in the serious industrial revolution cities, you see, with large, powerful working classes. And I'd like to push this, compare this actually with a very recent quotation from The Guardian from Jess Phillips, Labour MP from Birmingham, with quite a strong Birmingham accent. Actually, she's in the news again now, I noticed today. But she's the MP for Birmingham Yardley. She considers her Brummie accent one of her greatest assets, but notes outside of Parliament, people definitely will use it as a tool to have a go at you, she says. So the same thing's happening. They'll say you sound thick and you're common and don't speak properly. That's what you get. So she's got the dual perspective that I'm trying to push here. You know, she's aware of two contrasting ideologies around that accent. Okay, now that article in The Guardian is very interesting. It was on accent softening, and I hadn't heard that one before. People were going along, people who wanted jobs with these disfavoured accents. They were going to guys in London who'd live all salons, and they were basically just toning down some of the extreme features of the accent. They weren't trying to get rid of it. So that is possibly a sign of change in public ideologies a little bit. It's not the entire accent. You can accept it as long as it's not too much. That's what seems to be going on there. But I did find that interesting. And I think what we want to... What are we doing for time? Okay. I think I'll be at it for I've got another 10 minutes or so I'll talk. Okay? So what I want to do now is pull some of this together by looking at the way public debates about correctness take different forms in Britain and the US. Just to try and summarise it a bit. We've just made the observations so far. And in fact, the differences we've picked out are so far relatively consistent with stereotype perceptions of Britain as a class-ridden society. That's what the Americans think. That's what a lot of people think. And of America as a society where race, but not social class, is the chief divisor. What is constructed, in other words, as a natural or commonsensical set of concerns in one country may be puzzling or incomprehensible in the other. Okay? So let's look at what's meant by standard English or correct English in each country. Just try and pull it together a bit. Now, the most obvious point is that there is a reference point for popular conceptions of the spoken standard. Received pronunciation, it's not very easy to define actually, but sometimes Oxford English, BBC English, the Queen's English. But if you ask people what they mean by correct English, you get labels like that, and they are in fact class-based, and the reference point is usually some high status accent. It's high status and it relates to class. That's the key point. Saliently marked for social class. You can say that received pronunciation is however you define it, but it's never been used by a large number of speakers, and probably even fewer now. Now, in the United States, there is no identifiable and institutionally supported class-indexed accent, as far as we can see. Variously named General American, Network English, Mainstream United States English The standard is popularly perceived as a variety associated not with any particular social group, but more broadly with the levelled dialects of the northern Midwest. Now, by a levelled dialect, what we mean is dialects that are shorn of features which characterise stigmatised speakers. So you won't have African American English elements in it. You won't have East Coast, New York City stuff in it. Nothing like that. You just get rid of anything that causes offence, and that's basically what scholars like Walt Wolfram, how they define American Standard negatively. It's not got the things that cause offence in it. And Dennis Preston has done a lot of work on this. Some of you certainly know his work. And that's how he describes it. He reckons that people in Michigan reckon they speak the best English. And that, again, is shorn of these offensive features that are characteristic of stigmatized groups. And speakers of dialects there commonly describe themselves as having no accent. Now, I've not heard that phrase used much in Britain, have you? People generally don't talk that way. People usually have an accent and say, oh, he or she has got a slight Scottish accent, a slight northern accent, just a touch of it. But very seldom have I heard anyone using no accent, certainly not as a characterisation of the standard. I've occasionally heard modified RP speakers being described as having no accent. But, it's not the crucial point. And finally, on America, we've got a very, very famous comment by Theodore Roosevelt. This was a speech on immigration. He was president between 1901 and 1909. And again, we're dealing with that period at the turn of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century. Massive immigration. And he's quite clear here, and this is focusing, in fact, on the need for English to be the language of the United States. He says, we have room but for one language here, that is the English language, and that, of course, was the kind of thinking that triggered the English-only movement in the United States, the rejection of other languages. For we intend to see that the crucible turns our people out as Americans of American nationality, not as dwellers in a polyglot boarding house. Now, you've got multilingualism in Britain too, and there is plenty of prejudice against non-English speakers, but I've never quite seen it seen multilingualism treated as a serious issue, serious political issue by a high-status politician. There just is not quite that focus, in fact. Okay, so those are the contrasts between two English-speaking countries, and I think still sticking with the nationalist stuff. What I've been arguing is that the linchpin of each of the political ideologies is a very differently imagined standard. That's what I want to do here. Now, I'd like to round off this discussion of the link between language and distinctive national ideologies with the dramatically different case of modern Norway. Now, Norway was dominated by Denmark for 400 years until 1814. It's a very new state. That's the key thing about it. And then by Sweden until 1905. And when full independence was proclaimed and procured, that was at 95. So Norway was 1905. Norway was a very young nation, and its relatively recently constructed language ideologies are very different from those of nations with longer histories of national autonomy, like France or the UK, or even the US, which is somewhat younger than those nations. Now, Peter Krugill's written a lot here, and I've given you a reference to one of his books where he discusses it, and we'll give you more references. He comments that unlike the situation in England, where comments about bad English are common, there is no such thing as bad Norwegian. There simply are no bad dialects or accents. Children are taught to write standard Norwegian but their dialects are respected, and it is against the law for educators to correct the way children speak. So they can't do it. They're not allowed to do it. And I should point out, just a very small diversion here, I didn't understand this myself. I didn't know much about Norway. I still don't know a lot about it, but I know more than I used to. But many years ago, I think in the early 90s, I met a senior Norwegian scholar called Eva Sivertsen. And Eva Sivertsen had done work on Cockney women in Bethnal Green, Cockney-speaking women. Now, she told me, she said, you know, it was very interesting, and I thought I'd really hit the big time getting a chance to chat to Eva Sivertsen. I was delighted to meet her. I thought her work was wonderful. And she said, Gimson, the London politician, said, somebody should study this, but we can't do it. It'll destroy our careers, so you should. That's how that work began. Nobody in England would touch it. Okay? For reasons which I think should be obvious now. Now, I thought this was great, and making conversation with her, I said, well, what about spoken standard Norwegian? Is it associated with Oslo or Trondheim? And she said, there is no spoken standard Norwegian. There's only a written standard Norwegian. I didn't know that. Okay? So you have no concept of anything like what we've been talking about there in terms of the spoken standard. You've got other things going on with the standard I don't think we should get into. But anyway, that's the position with Norway. And Treadgill, in fact, he translates the current law. For spoken language in the classrooms, pupils and teaching staff decide for themselves which variety they will use. Staff and school managers, in their own choice of vocabulary and expression, shall also take into consideration, as much as possible, the local dialects of the pupils. So that is the legal position, in fact, in Norway. And it's a million miles away. And again, I would suggest that it's tied in with the history of Norway, very clearly, the desire for autonomy. And dialects were valued. It was a peasant state. It describes itself as a peasant state very much. Now, okay. I think, basically, I just want to say we want to look at how we can frame the terms of a meaningful debate and harness considerable public interest evident in popular books and media, personal comment, in political and educational discussion. And it would be a worthwhile endeavour. And I don't quite know how to do it, but I do think you need to look at the social dimensions of ideologies more broadly. You don't dismiss them as ignorant and wrong, but you look at their place in the social world. So you want to engage with them rather than treat them as deficient or irrelevant. And that's what I have tried to do here, to look at their association with history and culture and differences between them in different countries. And that's how I'd like to conclude, but I will just comment briefly on the books I've got at the end of the handout. Peter Treadgill's 2016 Dialect Matters, Respecting Vernacular Language. He's got a lot of materials here that are worth looking at for anybody. You guys from the sixth form would probably appreciate that a lot. But also he's got quite a lot of stuff on Norway. Now, I've referenced Jim's book and mine, Authority in Language. The latest edition of that came out in 2012, and we've got a lot on ideologies generally, and on American versus British, which you didn't get in the earlier versions. Rosina Lippy Green was a colleague of mine in Michigan, and she set out to write a book like Authority in Language, but relevant to America. And she ended up writing a book about race. Okay? So, again, the ideas we've come up with, race being the major linchpin in America, class in Britain, people fell into it when they tried to look at the way it worked. And so the title of her book is English with an Accent. Now her accent is a foreign accent. People with foreign accents run into trouble. And Verbal Hygiene, Deborah Cameron, in fact, focuses very, very much, as I've said, on class. Okay, well, I'll finish at that point. Thank you.